On the morning of July 4, 1863, while cannon fire echoed across Gettysburg's blood-soaked fields, a peculiar contraption rattled to life in a Washington workshop that would eventually walk into medical history on human legs. The device wasn't meant for walking, it was designed for killing, and killing efficiently. Richard Jordan Gatling stood before his revolutionary creation, wiping grease from calloused hands as the cylindrical barrel assembly gleamed in the lamplight. The Connecticut-born inventor had spent 2 years perfecting what newspapers would soon call the gun that never sleeps. A hand-cranked weapon capable of firing 200 rounds per minute, a rate so fantastical that military officers dismissed it as carnival trickery. But Gatling harbored darker motivations than mere mechanical novelty. His own bout with smallpox had nearly killed him the previous year, and he'd watched disease ravage more soldiers than Confederate bullets ever could. His twisted logic suggested that a weapon so devastating might shorten wars, thereby saving lives through superior lethality. The Gatling gun consisted of 6 to 10 barrels arranged around a central shaft, rotating as a hand crank turned, each barrel firing in sequence before cycling back to reload. Gravity-fed ammunition dropped from a hopper mounted above, and spent cartridges ejected downward in a continuous metallic rain. The weapon weighed approximately 170 pounds when mounted on its wheeled carriage, requiring a crew of 4 men to operate effectively. Its brass and iron components gleamed with the promise of industrialized warfare, transforming violence from an art practiced by individual marksmen into a factory process of mechanical death. The Union Army's Ordnance Department initially rejected Gatling's marvel, suspicious of both the inventor's Kentucky origins and his lack of military contracts. Undeterred, Gatling demonstrated his weapon to anyone who would watch, charging admission like a theatrical producer. Spectators gasped as wooden targets disintegrated under sustained fire, the rotating barrels producing a distinctive buzzing roar that sounded like angry hornets amplified through a church organ. One journalist present described it as the devil's music box, a phrase that stuck in public consciousness. By 1864, as Sherman marched toward Atlanta and Grant hammered at Petersburg's defenses, a handful of Gatling guns finally reached Union commanders who deployed them cautiously, more as psychological weapons than tactical necessities. Confederate soldiers who encountered the guns reported feeling paralyzed by the continuous fire, their minds unable to process the impossibility of reloading happening so rapidly. Traditional military doctrine offered no defense against such concentrated firepower. Yet for all its mechanical brilliance, the Gatling gun suffered from critical flaws. The hand crank required constant physical effort, the barrels overheated during sustained fire, and the paper cartridges often jammed when moisture invaded the mechanism. Gatling continuously modified his design, switching to brass cartridges and improving the feed system. But the weapon remained finicky and expensive. Most importantly, military tacticians couldn't envision how to properly deploy such a beast on Civil War battlefields dominated by artillery and massed infantry charges. What nobody predicted, not Gatling, not the generals, not the newspaper editorialists, was that this flying gun, as soldiers nicknamed it for the speed of its bullets, would within a generation find its strangest application not in warfare, but in medicine, replacing human limbs lost to the very conflicts it helped wage. The spring of 1865 brought Lee's surrender at Appomattox and a nation drowning in its own blood, with over 600,000 dead and countless thousands more bearing wounds that would haunt them forever. Dr. James Baxter, a Union Army surgeon stationed at Armory Square Hospital in Washington, spent 12-hour shifts performing a grim arithmetic of amputation, measuring how much leg or arm could be saved versus how much infection demanded sacrifice. Baxter had witnessed the Gatling gun's demonstration the previous year and remembered thinking how the precision-machined rotating mechanism seemed almost surgical in its efficiency. Now, elbow-deep in gangrenous tissue, he confronted a different kind of mechanical problem. The prosthetic limbs available to wounded veterans were medieval contraptions of wood and leather, heavy as millstones and nearly as useful. The standard-issue artificial leg, officially designated the palmar arm and leg, consisted of a carved wooden socket attached to a crude foot with minimal articulation. Veterans called them peg legs, with bitter irony, as even pirates in storybooks seemed better equipped. According to records examined in the National Museum of Health and Medicine archives, the Civil War produced approximately 45,000 amputations, with Confederate and Union surgeons sawing through bone at rates that would have shocked peacetime physicians. Chloroform and ether dulled the immediate agony, but soldiers woke to discover themselves permanently altered, their futures as uncertain as their balance. The government recognized its debt to these men, passing legislation in 1862 establishing the Great Civil War Benefaction, which provided $75 toward the purchase of an artificial limb, approximately $2,000 in modern currency, enough for a basic prosthetic but not nearly sufficient for anything approaching natural function. Entrepreneurs rushed to fill this tragic market. Patent offices overflowed with prosthetic designs ranging from ingenious to absurd: spring-loaded feet, articulated hands operated by shoulder harnesses, wooden legs equipped with secret compartments for whiskey flasks. Most shared a common failure. They were static devices that approximated the shape of a limb without capturing its motion. Walking required users to develop entirely new gaits, swinging the artificial leg forward in a stiff arc that announced their disability from 50 paces. The most innovative prosthetists recognized that the future lay in mechanical joints that could mimic natural movement. James Hanger, a Confederate veteran who lost his leg at Philippi in the war's first major land battle, designed a prosthetic with rubber bumpers and articulated joints that represented a significant advancement. His Hanger limb could bend at the knee and ankle, allowing users to walk with something approaching natural motion. Veterans who could afford Hanger's device, it cost significantly more than the government allowance, reported being able to climb stairs and even return to agricultural labor. But even Hanger's invention relied on passive mechanics, requiring the user to physically swing the leg forward using hip muscles. The holy grail of prosthetic design remained elusive, a device that could actively respond to the user's intentions, that contained enough mechanical complexity to anticipate and accommodate the infinite variations of human movement. Such a mechanism would require dozens of precisely machined parts working in concert, each component manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. As Dr. Baxter cleaned surgical instruments on a humid May evening, a thought crystallized that seemed simultaneously brilliant and insane. What if the precision manufacturing techniques that made the Gatling gun possible could be applied to artificial limbs? What if the rotating barrel mechanism's sophistication in timing and coordination could inspire prosthetic joints that moved with fluid grace? He dismissed the notion almost immediately, then retrieved it from dismissal, turning it over in his mind like a curious stone. In the autumn of 1867, the Industrial Revolution's mechanical heartbeat pounded loudest in Connecticut's Naugatuck River Valley, where factories transformed raw materials into finished goods with unprecedented efficiency. Thomas Ellington worked as a master machinist at the Colt Armory in Hartford, his days consumed by the precise tolerances required for firearm production. The 53-year-old craftsman had survived Antietam with a shattered right leg that surgeons amputated below the knee, leaving him dependent on a crude prosthetic that transformed every step into conscious effort. Ellington's workshop sat in the armory's corner, where he trained apprentices in the dark arts of precision machining. The lathe before him held a rotating steel shaft, and he guided the cutting tool with practiced subtlety, shaving metal away in curling ribbons that fell like mechanical confetti. His prosthetic leg, strapped on each morning with leather belts that chafed his stump raw, forced him to lean against the workbench for support. The constant pain had become his companion, as familiar as his own breath. One afternoon, while disassembling a Gatling gun for maintenance inspection, Ellington experienced what he would later describe as a moment of profound clarity. The weapon's rotating barrel mechanism employed a cam system that precisely coordinated each barrel's firing sequence. As one barrel fired, another loaded, while others cooled and ejected spent cartridges. The entire assembly moved with balletic precision, each component's motion perfectly timed to support the others. He held the cam mechanism in his hands, feeling its weight, studying how the grooves guided follower pins through predetermined paths that translated rotational motion into complex sequential movements. His mind made an intuitive leap that bridged warfare and medicine. A human knee wasn't a simple hinge. It rotated, slid, and pivoted through a complex range of motions that allowed walking, climbing, and kneeling. Current prosthetic designs treated the knee as a basic pivot point, but what if multiple movements could be coordinated through a cam system similar to the Gatling gun's mechanism? What if the forward swing of walking could automatically trigger subtle rotations and adjustments that mimicked natural joint movement? Ellington sketched furiously that evening, filling pages with mechanical diagrams that merged anatomical observation with engineering principle. He studied his own remaining leg obsessively, having his wife Martha trace the knee's motion through various activities. He measured angles, recorded timings, and built increasingly elaborate cardboard models that demonstrated how a cam-guided system might coordinate multiple axes of movement. Martha, initially skeptical of her husband's obsession, became his chief advocate after watching him crawl around the parlor floor with a homemade goniometer measuring knee angles. The technical challenges were staggering. The device would require strength to support body weight yet sufficient flexibility to respond to varied terrain. The cam mechanism must be adjustable to accommodate different walking speeds and the user's changing intentions. Most critically, everything must be manufactured to tolerances that prevented binding or excessive wear while remaining affordable enough for common veterans rather than just wealthy officers. Ellington presented his sketches to Colt Armory's chief engineer, a skeptical New Englander named Archibald Morse, who had approved thousands of mechanical designs and rejected twice as many. Morse studied the drawings for 20 silent minutes before asking the question that would define the project's future. Can you build it? Or are these just fever dreams? Ellington responded by limping to his workshop and emerging with a partially completed prototype, fashioned from scrap metal and salvaged Gatling gun components. The crude device looked like something assembled by a mechanically inclined madman. A cylindrical housing containing a cam mechanism salvaged from a Gatling gun's feed system, connected to a prosthetic knee joint through a series of linkages that Ellington had hand-filed to approximate specifications. It didn't work, not yet, but Morse could see the underlying genius. The cam's rotation, driven by the user's hip motion, could theoretically coordinate knee flexion with subtle rotational adjustments, creating something closer to natural movement than any existing prosthetic. You'll need funding, Morse said finally, and you'll need it from someone with deeper pockets than Colt and more vision than the War Department. The winter of 1868 found Richard Jordan Gatling in an unexpected crisis, despite his gun's growing military adoption. European armies had begun manufacturing their own rotating barrel weapons, often improving upon his original design, and Gatling faced patent disputes that threatened to drain his finances dry. More troubling was his growing discomfort with his invention's legacy. The weapon had failed to shorten wars as he'd hoped, but instead made slaughter more efficient. Now 50 years old, the inventor sought redemption through a project that might save rather than destroy. Thomas Ellington's letter reached Gatling through circuitous channels, forwarded by mutual acquaintances in the engineering community. The proposal struck Gatling as simultaneously audacious and obvious. Of course, his precision manufacturing techniques could serve medicine as effectively as warfare. The inventor traveled to Hartford in February, arriving during a snowstorm that paralyzed the city and gave him extended time to examine Ellington's prototypes. The two men represented different Americas. Gatling, the educated inventor-entrepreneur from North Carolina, Ellington, the working-class machinist from Connecticut, but they shared a mechanical intuition that transcended social boundaries. In Ellington's workshop, surrounded by half-completed prototypes and walls papered with anatomical sketches, they discussed tolerances and cam profiles, while snow accumulated outside. Gatling immediately grasped the brilliance of adapting his gun's timing mechanism to coordinate prosthetic joint movements. The principle is identical, Gatling said, sketching modifications to Ellington's cam design. In the gun, rotation coordinates firing sequence. In your leg, rotation coordinates joint movements through a gait cycle. The mathematics are nearly identical: timing, coordination, sequential action. They worked through the night, fueled by coffee and shared purpose. Gatling contributed his manufacturing expertise, explaining how the interchangeable part system developed for firearms could reduce prosthetic costs while ensuring consistent quality. Ellington provided anatomical insights gained from living with amputation, explaining how weight distribution and balance affected every movement. Together, they redesigned the cam mechanism to be lighter and more responsive, while maintaining the precision that made the Gatling gun revolutionary. By dawn, they had outlined a device they called the ambulatory assistance mechanism, a prosthetic leg incorporating a modified Gatling gun cam system that would coordinate knee and ankle movements throughout the walking cycle. The name was deliberately clinical, avoiding direct reference to the weapon that inspired it. Martha Ellington brought breakfast and found the two men surrounded by sketches and rough prototypes, looking like children who had stayed up building toy boats. Gatling committed $5,000 of his personal funds to the project, a substantial sum that would cover materials, machining time, and living expenses for Ellington to work full-time on development. More importantly, he leveraged his network of precision manufacturers to secure component production at reduced costs. Machine shops across Connecticut that manufactured Gatling gun parts began producing cam mechanisms and joint assemblies for prosthetic limbs, often using the same equipment and employing the same craftsmen. The partnership faced immediate challenges. The Gatling gun's components operated in a relatively clean environment, protected from dust and moisture. A prosthetic leg would be exposed to rain, mud, and the corrosive chemistry of human sweat. They experimented with protective housings made from vulcanized rubber and leather, testing each design by dragging prototypes through Hartford's muddy streets. Ellington wore early versions himself, providing brutally honest feedback about pinch points, weight distribution, and the audible clicking of cam mechanisms that announced the wearer's prosthetic status from 20 feet away. By summer, they had produced a functional prototype that represented a quantum leap beyond existing prosthetics. The device weighed 9 pounds, heavy compared to simple peg legs but reasonable given its mechanical complexity. The cam system, protected within a brass housing, coordinated knee flexion and extension while simultaneously controlling ankle angle through a linkage system. Most remarkably, the mechanism adapted automatically to walking speed. Faster hip motion rotated the cam more quickly, producing longer strides without conscious adjustment from the user. Dr. James Baxter, who had continued corresponding with prosthetic innovators, received an invitation to Hartford to evaluate the device. His assessment would determine whether the ambulatory assistance mechanism was a genuine breakthrough or an expensive mechanical curiosity. On August 15, 1868, James Baxter arrived at Hartford's train station to witness what its creators promised would revolutionize prosthetic medicine. The physician had evaluated dozens of artificial limbs during his post-war medical practice, and skepticism had become his default position. Too many inventors promised miracles while delivering expensive disappointments that left veterans poorer and no more mobile. Ellington met Baxter at the workshop where 5 men waited nervously. All Civil War veterans, all amputees, all volunteers who had agreed to test the new device. The oldest was 47-year-old Samuel Morrison, a former cavalry sergeant who lost his left leg at Cold Harbor. The youngest, Timothy Walsh, was barely 21, his right leg taken by a Confederate artillery shell at Petersburg when he was 17. Each man carried the invisible weight of their disability alongside the visible burden of crude prosthetics that announced their diminishment to every observer. The testing protocol was Baxter's design, informed by years of observing how veterans actually lived rather than how inventors imagined they lived. First, each volunteer would walk 50 paces on level ground, and observers would note gait abnormalities. Second, they would navigate stairs, both ascending and descending. Third, they would attempt to rise from a seated position without using their hands, a crucial test of the device's stability and the user's confidence. Finally, they would walk across uneven ground strewn with obstacles, simulating the reality of rural America where most veterans lived. Morrison went first, his existing prosthetic a basic wooden leg with a leather socket that forced him to swing the entire limb forward rigidly. Baxter timed him at 53 seconds to cover 50 paces, each step visible from the hip's exaggerated rotation. Stairs were worse. Morrison ascended sideways, leading with his intact leg and dragging the prosthetic to meet it on each step, a method called step-to gait that was exhausting and time-consuming. Then Ellington and an assistant fitted Morrison with the ambulatory assistance mechanism. The process took 15 minutes. adjusting straps and ensuring proper alignment. The device's brass housing gleamed in the afternoon light, and several witnesses noted its resemblance to a Gatling gun's mechanism. When Morrison stood, his expression shifted from curiosity to concentration. Ellington explained the device's operation. Walk normally. The mechanism will coordinate knee and ankle movement automatically. Trust it. Morrison's first steps were cautious, expecting the rigid resistance of his usual prosthetic. Instead, the knee flexed smoothly during swing phase, and the ankle adjusted to match the floor angle. His fourth step showed visible relaxation as his nervous system accepted the device's assistance. By his 10th step, observers could barely detect which leg was prosthetic. Baxter's stopwatch recorded 41 seconds for 50 paces, a 23% improvement that translated to genuine functional independence. The stairs revealed the device's true innovation. The cam mechanism automatically adjusted to the increased hip flexion required for stair climbing, providing appropriate knee flexion for step clearance and then stability for weight bearing. Morrison ascended using a reciprocal pattern, alternating legs as able-bodied people do, rather than the exhausting step-to method. When he reached the top, his eyes were wet with tears. "I haven't walked up stairs like that since Cold Harbor," Morrison said quietly. "I'd forgotten what it felt like." Walsh, the youngest tester, adapted even more quickly. His youth and relatively recent amputation meant less ingrained compensation patterns. With the new prosthetic, he walked, climbed, and navigated obstacles with such fluidity that Baxter had to verify which leg was artificial. The physician made extensive notes, measuring gait parameters and recording each volunteer's subjective experience. The uneven terrain test provided unexpected drama. As Walsh crossed a section deliberately cluttered with wooden blocks and rope coils, he stumbled when his prosthetic foot caught a rope. Observers gasped, expecting a fall that could injure the volunteer and destroy the prototype. Instead, the cam mechanism responded to Walsh's instinctive recovery movements, the knee flexing at precisely the right moment to help him regain balance. He caught himself, stood still for a moment processing what had happened, then continued walking with a grin spreading across his face. "It helped me catch myself," Walsh explained later. "It didn't just hang there dead, it responded." Baxter's report to the American Medical Association, submitted in September, contained language uncharacteristically enthusiastic for the normally restrained physician. As documented in the association's journal archives from that period, he wrote, "This device represents the first practical application of precision manufacturing principles to prosthetic medicine. The coordinated joint movements achieved through the cam mechanism approximate natural gait more successfully than any previous design." By the spring of 1869, Gatling and Ellington faced the challenge that destroys most inventions, transitioning from successful prototype to manufacturable product. Their workshop could produce perhaps 2 devices monthly, each requiring weeks of hand-fitting and adjustment. America had tens of thousands of amputee veterans, and more civilians lost limbs daily to industrial accidents, infections, and the general hazards of 19th-century life. The question wasn't whether the ambulatory assistance mechanism worked, but whether it could be produced affordably and in sufficient quantities to matter. Gatling proposed an audacious solution: establish a dedicated prosthetic manufacturing facility using the same interchangeable parts system that made his gun practical for military adoption. The Colt Armory had perfected techniques for producing identical components by the thousands, each part manufactured to specifications that allowed assembly without custom fitting. Applied to prosthetics, this approach could reduce costs dramatically while ensuring consistent quality. Finding financial backing proved surprisingly easy. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad magnate whose own son had lost a leg in a riding accident, contributed $15,000 after witnessing a demonstration. Additional funds came from veterans organizations, medical societies, and wealthy individuals moved by the device's potential. By June, they had secured sufficient capital to lease a 3-story brick building in Hartford's industrial district and purchase the equipment necessary for volume production. The Hartford Prosthetic Manufacturing Company opened on September 1, 1869, with 30 employees, mostly machinists and metal workers recruited from weapons factories. Ellington served as technical director, translating his handcrafted prototypes into manufacturing specifications. Each component was assigned precise dimensions, tolerances, and finishing requirements. The cam mechanisms, still the device's heart, were manufactured using modified Gatling gun equipment, their grooves cut by lathes operated by men who had recently been cutting identical grooves for weapons. The factory floor buzzed with industrial energy that contrasted sharply with the product's humanitarian purpose. Drop hammers forged socket components while precision mills cut cam profiles. Leather workers stitched suspension harnesses alongside metal workers assembling joint mechanisms. Quality control inspectors measured every component against specifications, rejecting parts that deviated beyond acceptable tolerances. Rejected components were melted and recast. Waste was minimal, efficiency was paramount. Initial production ran at 10 devices weekly, climbing to 20 by November as workers mastered the processes. Each prosthetic required approximately 40 hours of labor distributed across multiple craftsmen, from rough casting to final assembly. The factory price was established at $115, expensive compared to basic peg legs, but reasonable given the mechanical complexity and representing only a modest markup over manufacturing costs. Gatling insisted on keeping profits minimal, viewing the venture as partial redemption for his weapon's deadly efficiency. Veterans began arriving in Hartford seeking fittings, and the company established a clinic where prosthetists, a new medical specialty created by the device's complexity, assessed patients, selected appropriate components, and performed the careful alignment necessary for optimal function. The fitting process took 3 days: initial assessment and socket molding on day 1, test fitting and adjustment on day 2, final fitting and gait training on day 3. Patients stayed in boarding houses near the factory, creating a small economy around prosthetic rehabilitation. Stories spread through veterans' networks with the speed of telegraph messages. Men who had resigned themselves to disability learned that walking naturally might be possible. Letters arrived from across the country, some barely literate, others eloquently desperate, all seeking the same thing: restoration of the independence that amputation had stolen. The company received more than 300 requests during its first 6 months, overwhelming production capacity and creating a waiting list that stretched into the following year. Not everyone praised the innovation. Some physicians argued that expensive mechanical devices distracted from the real solution, preventing amputations through better surgical technique and wound care. Others worried that veterans would bankrupt themselves pursuing mechanical fantasies when simpler prosthetics worked adequately. A few medical journal articles suggested the entire enterprise was commercializing suffering, with Gatling profiting from the very destruction his gun had caused. Gatling addressed these criticisms directly in a letter published in multiple medical journals during December 1869, in which he wrote, "Those who suggest my involvement represents unseemly profiting misunderstand both my motivations and the company's financial structure. Profits beyond modest returns necessary to sustain operations will be dedicated to providing devices at reduced cost to indigent veterans. I cannot unmake my gun's contribution to warfare's horrors, but I can ensure its mechanical principles serve restoration rather than destruction." The Hartford Prosthetic Manufacturing Company closed its first year having produced 417 devices. Early recipients reported dramatic improvements in mobility, independence, and, perhaps most significantly, psychological well-being. The winter of 1870 brought both triumph and tragedy to the Hartford Prosthetic Manufacturing Company. Production had increased to 30 devices weekly, waiting lists extended 18 months, and satisfied users provided testimonials that attracted broader public attention. Then, on February 9th, former Sergeant Morrison, one of the original test subjects whose tears had validated the device's promise, died of pneumonia complicated by infection at the amputation site, a reminder that artificial limbs solved only one dimension of a complex medical reality. Morrison's death prompted Ellington to focus intensely on the interface between human tissue and mechanical device. The socket, the cup-like component that enclosed the residual limb, represented the critical connection where engineering met biology, and failure at this junction caused pain, skin breakdown, and infection regardless of how sophisticated the mechanical knee might be. Existing socket designs prioritized structural support over tissue health, accepting that users would experience varying degrees of discomfort. Dr. Baxter joined the company as medical director, bringing his surgical expertise to bear on the socket design problem. Together with Ellington, he studied anatomy texts, interviewed users extensively, and examined dozens of residual limbs at various stages of healing and adaptation. They discovered that amputation stumps changed shape over time, swelling and shrinking with activity levels, weight fluctuations, and simple daily variations. A socket that fit perfectly in the morning might be uncomfortable by evening. Their solution involved multiple innovations applied simultaneously. First, they replaced rigid wooden sockets with leather-lined metal frames that distributed pressure more evenly. Second, they incorporated a wool felt liner that compressed and rebounded with use, accommodating minor shape variations. Third, and most radically, they designed an adjustable socket with brass screws that allowed users to modify circumference as their stump's volume changed, a feature that required educating users in basic biomechanical principles but granted them agency over their own comfort. The improved socket system, introduced in April 1870, reduced skin breakdown incidence by an estimated 60% based on follow-up surveys of users. More importantly, it acknowledged that prosthetic use wasn't a static condition, but an ongoing relationship between person and device requiring continuous adjustment. This philosophy, that successful prosthetics must adapt to users rather than forcing users to adapt to rigid mechanical constraints, became foundational to the company's design approach. Meanwhile, the cam mechanism itself evolved through iterative improvements driven by user feedback. The original design worked well for level ground walking, but struggled with slopes, particularly descents, where the cam timing didn't match the altered gait patterns required. Ellington's team developed interchangeable cam sets, a standard configuration for level walking, an alternative for predominantly hilly terrain, and a third optimized for industrial environments, where stairs and ladders dominated. Users could swap cam assemblies using basic tools, customizing the device to their specific needs. This modular approach had been pioneered in firearms manufacturing, where interchangeable parts allowed field repairs and configuration changes. Applied to prosthetics, it transformed a single device into an adaptable system. A farmer might use the standard cam during planting season when fieldwork demanded extended level walking, then switch to the hill climbing cam during harvest when varied terrain became more common. The ability to modify one's own prosthetic fostered a sense of mastery that psychological studies would later identify as crucial to successful adaptation. The company also confronted aesthetic concerns that had been dismissed initially as vanity. Veterans reported that the exposed brass cam housing, however mechanically brilliant, announced their disability prominently. Children stared, strangers asked intrusive questions, and potential employers made assumptions about capability based on visible mechanical components. In response, Ellington designed cosmetic covers, shaped leather housings that concealed the mechanism while maintaining ventilation necessary to prevent moisture accumulation. These covers could be tailored to resemble normal trousers, rendering the prosthetic essentially invisible under clothing. The cosmetic covers sparked debate within the disability community. Some users celebrated the ability to pass as able-bodied, viewing visibility as an unfortunate burden rather than an identity marker. Others argued that concealment implied shame, suggesting disability required hiding. One user, a former infantry lieutenant named Marcus Weatherly, wrote eloquently on the subject, "I don't hide my prosthetic from shame, but from exhaustion. I tire of being defined by my amputation before people know my name, my work, or my thoughts. The cover grants me the dignity of being known before being pitied." By year's end, the Hartford Prosthetic Manufacturing Company had produced 934 devices and employed 87 people. Component manufacturing had been streamlined to the point where a skilled machinist could produce cam mechanisms at a rate of 12 daily, and socket fabrication had been systematized to accommodate the range of human anatomical variation. The spring of 1871 witnessed the Hartford Prosthetic Manufacturing Company's innovations spreading beyond veterans to reshape broader prosthetic medicine. Industrial accidents, commonplace in an era of unguarded machinery and minimal safety regulations, created a steady stream of civilian amputees who had previously been relegated to basic peg legs or unemployment. Now, factory workers who lost limbs in loom accidents or railroad workers crushed by coupling mechanisms could potentially return to productive employment with sophisticated prosthetics that restored functional capability. Insurance companies took notice, commissioning actuarial studies that calculated the cost-benefit ratio of providing advanced prosthetics to injured workers. The mathematics proved compelling. A worker equipped with a Hartford device could return to perhaps 75% of previous productivity, generating taxable income and avoiding the poorhouse. A worker with a basic peg leg might manage 30% productivity or, more likely, become permanently dependent on charity. Hartford Mutual Insurance began offering prosthetic coverage as part of industrial accident policies, setting premiums based on occupation and negotiating bulk pricing with manufacturing companies. This commercialization of rehabilitation created ethical complexities that society struggled to address. Workers' compensation systems, still rudimentary in most states, faced pressure to cover advanced prosthetics, but employers argued that basic functionality satisfied legal obligations. Medical ethicists debated whether sophisticated devices should be distributed based on economic productivity, medical need, or some combination of factors. A young laborer with decades of potential work life ahead competed for resources against elderly veterans whose contributions had been made, but whose sacrifices demanded recognition. The Hartford Company attempted to navigate these contradictions through a tiered pricing structure. Standard devices sold at $115, covering manufacturing costs plus modest profit. Enhanced models incorporating the latest improvements cost $165. With the $50 premium subsidizing a charitable fund that provided devices at reduced cost to indigent applicants. By 1872, approximately 1/4 of production was subsidized through this mechanism, allowing the company to serve both paying customers and those who couldn't afford market prices. Meanwhile, physicians began documenting the psychological dimensions of prosthetic rehabilitation with increasing sophistication. Dr. Baxter published a groundbreaking paper in the American Journal of Medical Science titled The Phantom Limb Phenomenon and Mechanical Restoration, in which he described how prosthetic users continued experiencing sensations in absent limbs but reported reduced phantom pain when using devices that closely approximated natural movement. He theorized that the brain's motor planning systems required consistent sensory feedback, and prosthetics that moved predictably provided that feedback more effectively than static devices. The medical community's growing understanding of prosthetics as neuromechanical systems, rather than purely mechanical replacements, influenced device design. Ellington's team began incorporating subtle resistance mechanisms into joints, providing tactile feedback that helped users gauge joint position without visual confirmation. They experimented with different materials for foot components, seeking combinations that provided appropriate ground feedback while maintaining durability. Each modification reflected the recognition that successful prosthetics must integrate with the user's neuromuscular system, becoming extensions of body schema rather than external tools. Competition emerged as prosthetic manufacturing's profitability became apparent. Companies in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago established facilities using principles pioneered in Hartford, but incorporating their own innovations. Some focused on upper extremity prosthetics, developing mechanical hands with articulated fingers operated through body-powered cable systems. Others specialized in pediatric devices, addressing the unique challenges of growing children who required frequent replacements as their bodies developed. This diversification accelerated innovation as manufacturers competed for market share and patent protections. The original Gatling gun connection faded from public awareness as prosthetic manufacturing established its own identity. New employees at the Hartford facility often didn't realize that their precision cam-cutting equipment had been designed originally for weapons production, and users rarely connected their mobility to military technology. This disconnection suited Gatling, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his guns' expanding military adoption. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 had seen Gatling guns used by both sides, and casualty reports suggested that rapid-fire weapons were indeed making conflicts more lethal rather than shorter. Thomas Ellington received a letter in March 1872 from a French physician named Dr. Antoine Rousseau, who had encountered Hartford prosthetics on wounded soldiers and wished to establish licensed manufacturing in Europe. The letter marked the beginning of international expansion that would eventually see Hartford-designed devices produced in 7 countries across 3 continents, carrying the principles of precision manufacturing and adaptive design to a global community of amputees seeking restoration of independence and dignity. The autumn of 1873 brought Jonathan Carlyle to Hartford, a 41-year-old schoolteacher from Vermont whose left leg had been crushed by a falling tree during a logging accident that previous spring. Carlyle's journey illustrates the intersection of technological innovation and individual human experience that transformed prosthetics from crude substitutes into genuine restorative devices. The accident had occurred on May 23rd, while Carlyle helped a neighbor clear land. The tree, undermined by rot at its base, fell unpredictably, pinning Carlyle's leg against a granite outcropping. The local physician amputated above the knee after infection set in, and Carlyle spent 3 months recovering physically, while confronting the psychological devastation of permanent disability. As the sole income earner for his wife and 3 children, his inability to return to teaching. Schools preferred teachers who could stand for hours and move easily between students, threatened his family with poverty. A fellow teacher had read about Hartford prosthetics in Harper's Weekly and pooled resources from the community to fund Carlyle's journey to Connecticut. He arrived at the factory clinic in October, carrying a letter of introduction and wearing an ill-fitting wooden leg that had cost $8 and provided approximately $8 worth of functionality. Dr. Baxter conducted the initial assessment, measuring not just the residual limbs dimensions but also Carlyle's hip strength, balance, and psychological readiness for intensive rehabilitation. The fitting process revealed complexities that pure engineering couldn't address. Carlyle's amputation level, above the knee, created additional challenges because the prosthetic must incorporate both knee and ankle mechanisms while relying solely on the remaining femur for control. The socket design became critical, using Carlyle's thigh musculature to transmit control signals through socket pressure variations. The prosthetist, a skilled craftsman named William Reynolds, spent hours with Carlyle, teaching him to flex specific muscle groups while observing how these contractions could be harnessed to control the mechanical knee. Think of it as learning a musical instrument, Reynolds explained during a particularly frustrating training session. Your body must learn new patterns, and repetition builds the neural pathways that make movement automatic. Carlyle's training notebook, preserved in the Hartford Historical Society archives, documents his 3-week rehabilitation journey. Early entries record frustration. Cannot make the blasted knee bend when I wish it to. Feels as though I'm operating a marionette of myself. Later entries show progress. Walked 12 steps without concentrating on each movement. The mechanism anticipated my intention somehow. By the final week, climbed stairs at the boarding house without thinking. My body has learned the device's language. The moment of transformation came during Carlyle's final evaluation. Dr. Baxter had arranged for a classroom to be temporarily set up in the factory's administrative building, complete with student desks and a chalkboard. Carlyle was asked to teach a brief geography lesson while Baxter and Reynolds observed from the back. For 20 minutes, Carlyle moved naturally through the space, pointing at the chalkboard, walking between desks, kneeling briefly to help an imaginary struggling student, all actions impossible with his previous prosthetic. When the evaluation concluded, Carlyle stood silently at the chalkboard for a long moment before speaking. I had accepted that teaching was finished, he said quietly. I had begun planning how to support my family through correspondence work or bookkeeping. You've given me back my profession, which means you've given me back myself. Stories like Carlyle's multiplied as Hartford prosthetics reached broader populations. Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old seamstress from Maryland, lost her right leg to a blood infection following childbirth. The standard medical advice was to abandon her trade since sewing required hours of foot pedal operation. With a Hartford prosthetic, she modified her sewing machine's pedal mechanism to work with the artificial foot and returned to work within 5 months. Her employer, initially skeptical, reported that Mitchell's productivity actually exceeded pre-amputation levels, because her prosthetic never grew tired, maintaining consistent pedal pressure through long workdays. Former Corporal Henry Davidson used his prosthetic to literally walk from Georgia to Hartford, a journey of over 1,000 miles undertaken to prove the device's durability and to inspire other Southern veterans who couldn't afford travel to fitting clinics. Davidson departed Atlanta in March 1874 and arrived in Hartford on June 12, his prosthetic showing wear but remaining functional. His journey attracted newspaper coverage across his route, and Gatling personally met Davidson at the factory, where mechanics serviced his prosthetic at no charge, and Davidson spent 2 weeks sharing his experience with other users. These individual narratives collectively demonstrated that prosthetic success couldn't be measured purely through mechanical specifications or clinical gait analysis. The true metric was life restoration, the ability to pursue meaningful work, maintain family responsibilities, engage in community activities, and preserve the sense of dignity that comes from self-sufficiency. Hartford's devices succeeded not because they perfectly replicated biological legs, but because they enabled users to resume interrupted life narratives. The company began collecting user testimonials systematically, recognizing their value for both marketing and product development. A standard questionnaire asked about walking distance capability, stair climbing proficiency, occupational status, and psychological well-being. Responses revealed patterns that influenced design iterations. Users consistently reported that even small reductions in weight dramatically improved endurance. The ability to adjust the device themselves, rather than requiring professional service, enhanced user confidence and satisfaction. Cosmetic appearance mattered more than engineers had initially assumed, with many users prioritizing normal appearance over minor functional advantages. By December 1874, the Hartford Prosthetic Manufacturing Company had produced over 4,000 devices and had received correspondence from users in 37 states and 6 foreign countries. The waiting list for new devices had shrunk to 3 months as production capacity expanded. Component costs had decreased through manufacturing efficiencies, allowing modest price reductions that made devices accessible to more economic classes. But success created its own challenges. Quality control became more difficult as production scaled. A batch of defective cam mechanisms in October 1874 caused knee failures in 17 devices, leading to user falls and injuries. The company recalled the entire batch and implemented more rigorous inspection protocols, but the incident damaged the brand's reputation and reminded everyone that mechanical devices serving weight-bearing functions carried inherent risks. One user, a railroad conductor named Albert Preston, suffered a fractured hip from a prosthetic failure and sued the company for damages, the first product liability case involving medical devices that would eventually reshape manufacturing standards across multiple industries. The centennial year of 1876 found Richard Jordan Gatling in declining health, but witnessing the fruition of his redemptive vision. At 62 years old, his gun had become standard military equipment for armies worldwide. But the prosthetic company, bearing his principles of precision manufacturing, had restored mobility to over 8,000 amputees. In a lengthy interview published in Scientific American that May, according to records preserved in the magazine's historical archives, Gatling reflected, "A man's legacy is measured not by his inventions but by their consequences. If the Gatling gun is remembered primarily as inspiration for restorative devices, rather than as an instrument of warfare, I will consider my life's work redeemed." Thomas Ellington had become prosthetic medicine's leading technical authority, publishing extensively on biomechanics and training a new generation of prosthetists who combined engineering knowledge with medical understanding. His workshop had evolved into a research laboratory where improvements were tested rigorously before implementation. By 1876, the standard Hartford prosthetic incorporated over 40 design refinements compared to the original 1868 prototype, yet the core cam-based coordination mechanism remained fundamentally unchanged, a testament to the original insight's validity. The broader medical community had come to recognize prosthetics as a legitimate specialty rather than a commercial sideline. Medical schools began offering coursework in rehabilitation medicine, and professional societies established standards for prosthetist training and certification. The American Prosthetic Association, founded in 1874, held annual conferences where practitioners shared techniques and manufacturers demonstrated innovations. What had been an ad hoc field practiced by tinkers and craftsmen was becoming a profession with systematic knowledge bases and ethical standards. The economic impact extended beyond direct device sales. Hartford's success had spawned an entire industry employing thousands in manufacturing, fitting, maintenance, and training. Machine shops specialized in prosthetic components. Leather workers focused on socket fabrication. Small businesses offered repair services, and inventors patented accessories like specialized shoes designed to work optimally with prosthetic feet. The prosthetic industry had become economically significant while serving humanitarian purposes, a rare alignment of profit and social benefit. Internationally, the principles pioneered in Hartford spread through licensing agreements and direct imitation. European manufacturers produced devices incorporating cam-based coordination systems, and Japanese engineers adapted the technology for their context. Each culture brought unique perspectives: German emphasis on mechanical precision, French focus on aesthetic refinement, British attention to durability under harsh conditions. This cross-pollination of ideas accelerated innovation globally, yet challenges remained. Above-knee amputation still produced less satisfactory outcomes than below-knee cases, since controlling a mechanical knee through socket pressure alone remained imperfect. Bilateral amputees, those who lost both legs, faced exponentially greater difficulties since prosthetic devices couldn't provide the balance information normally supplied by at least one intact limb. Children required frequent device replacements as they grew, creating financial burdens that public assistance programs addressed inconsistently. The most persistent challenge was the interface between living tissue and mechanical device. Despite improvements in socket design, users still experienced varying degrees of discomfort, skin breakdown, and infection. Some bodies rejected prosthetic use entirely, developing such severe tissue reactions that abandoning the device became medically necessary. Researchers recognized that the ultimate solution required better understanding of wound healing, tissue mechanics, and the body's response to chronic mechanical stress, problems that would occupy medical science for generations. By 1880, when Thomas Ellington died at 66 from heart failure, the Hartford Prosthetic Manufacturing Company employed over 300 people and had produced 23,000 devices. His funeral drew hundreds, including amputees who walked confidently on prosthetics he had designed. One attendee, former Sergeant Morrison's widow, placed a small brass cam mechanism on Ellington's casket, a gesture recognizing that the machinist's genius had transformed warfare's destructive innovation into medicine's restorative tool. Richard Jordan Gatling survived until 1903, living long enough to see his gun made obsolete by more advanced automatic weapons, while prosthetic devices based on his manufacturing principles continued evolving. Shortly before his death at 85, he told his physician, "I created a machine that took thousands of legs. That this same machine's principles helped restore mobility to thousands more provides cold comfort, but it is the only comfort available." The story of how America's flying gun became a walking leg illustrates technology's moral ambiguity. The same precision manufacturing that made rapid-fire weapons practical enabled prosthetics that approximated natural movement. The engineering sophistication developed for destruction proved equally applicable to restoration. The cam mechanism that coordinated sequential firing could coordinate sequential joint movements. What changed wasn't the technology, but the intention behind its application. Modern prosthetics have advanced far beyond the cam-driven mechanical devices of the 1870s. Contemporary designs incorporate microprocessors, carbon fiber composites, and sometimes direct neural interfaces that allow thought-controlled movement. Yet the fundamental insight that successful prosthetics require precise coordination of multiple mechanical functions, the insight born from studying Gatling gun mechanisms, remains central to prosthetic design. Today's devices are more sophisticated, but they're built on principles established when machinists and inventors recognized that precision manufacturing serves healing as effectively as it serves harm. The Hartford Prosthetic Manufacturing Company operated until 1943, when wartime production demands converted the facility to manufacturing aircraft components. By then, it had produced over 200,000 prosthetic devices and trained hundreds of prosthetists who spread across America and beyond. The building itself was demolished in 1967, replaced by a shopping center that now occupies the site. A small historical marker notes the location's significance, though few shoppers pause to read it. Yet the legacy walks among us still, quite literally. Every prosthetic device incorporating coordinated mechanical joints owes intellectual debt to Thomas Ellington's recognition that a weapon's timing mechanism could guide a leg's movements. Every amputee who walks confidently on artificial limbs benefits from manufacturing precision developed originally for military purposes. Every prosthetist adjusting socket alignment or cam timing practices skills descended from 1870s innovations born in Hartford workshops. Technology, this story reminds us, possesses no inherent moral character. The Gatling gun killed efficiently. The prosthetic leg restored mobility efficiently. The same machinists lathe-cut components for both. The same engineering principles guided both designs. What differed was human intention, the choice to apply mechanical knowledge toward destruction or restoration, harm or healing. In the end, perhaps that's the real story of America's absurd flying gun that became a leg. Not the technological cleverness, but the human capacity to recognize that tools serving one purpose might serve another, that destruction's mechanisms might inform creation's methods, and that redemption sometimes comes through transforming our worst innovations into instruments of restoration. The cam mechanism spinning inside a prosthetic knee, coordinating movements that let an amputee climb stairs or walk across fields, represents more than engineering ingenuity. It represents the possibility that even our most destructive creations might ultimately serve life rather than death, if we possess sufficient imagination and moral commitment to redirect their power toward healing rather than harm. Thomas Ellington understood this intuitively when he held that Gatling gun cam mechanism and envisioned it coordinating knee movements instead of barrel rotations. Richard Jordan Gatling grasped it when he funded prosthetic development seeking redemption for his weapon's consequences. And thousands of amputees experienced it directly when they took their first confident steps on devices descended from warfare's machinery, but serving peace's purposes. The story continues today, written not in historical documents but in the daily lives of amputees worldwide who walk, run, climb, and dance on prosthetic devices that trace their engineering lineage back to a Connecticut workshop where a gun became a leg, and destruction's tools were transformed into restoration's instruments.